So today we're going to start now with the first speaker for today is Robrecht. Professor Robrecht van der Velde, he's an associate professor of psychology and he's the department chair at Rutgers University in Camden. As you'll hear from his accent, he's originally from the Netherlands. I met Robrecht at Penn State University when he was doing his PhD there, when I was a postdoc there. After that, he had a postdoc in Nijmegen, and today most of his research focuses on how we plan and coordinate our movements with those of others. Okay. Thanks, Robert.
Okay, great. Well, looks like a very nice and interesting group of people today, so I'm excited to see what today brings. This morning when I woke up, my wife was supposed to come along with me to go to this very exciting slow movement meeting, and then she looked at the beach and said, you know what, I'll see you later. So can't blame her for that one. So I hope that my talk today will give you some idea of broadly what kinds of topics I work on. It includes some individual motor control. I did my PhD with David Rosenbaum at Penn State. And then I moved on to more joint action work. How do people coordinate with others? So I think this group is actually a nice mix of both of those traditions as well. So we'll see how this goes. As Jason already alluded to, I don't know if this is going to play this video actually. There should be internet connection, right? Well, this one is not so important, but mankind has an obsession with moving quickly. Right? Entire Olympic disciplines are centered around the premise of moving as quickly as we can. And maybe one goal for us today should be to come up with an Olympic sport of moving slowly. I'm not aware of any. So moving quickly is very much an obsession of mankind. And actually in psychology and cognitive science, early tradition there too has been to gain a really decent understanding of how people behave when you ask them to move as quickly as they can. And this has actually been formalized by Fitts' law. So if you ask people to make goal-directed movements between two targets, it turns out that there's a very orderly relationship, such that, not surprisingly, if you have to move farther, of course, it takes longer. But also, as the width of the target decreases, this also increases movement time. So that is formalized as Fitts' law. Time to move is a function of what's called the index of difficulty there on the right, and the index of difficulty is a function of the width of the target and the distance between the targets. Now this is called a law, not because Fitts said so, but because this got replicated so many times in so many settings, different limbs of the body, whether you're making neck movements or finger movements between targets, you get this same phenomenon that you can fit this straight log linear function that very nicely captures how long it will take people to move. So this is fairly well understood. Now, as Jason said too, that's always when we ask people, do something as quickly as we can. Most of our lives is fortunately not entirely like that, right? So one of my early studies with David and Dagmar Sternat, I had this too. So Tai Chi, what does Fitts' law say about slow movements in Tai Chi? Or why people move slower when they suffer from depression? Or, when people suffer from Parkinson's or have had a stroke? Fitts' law has very little to say about any of those things. My formatting got a little off here, but I'll look at two of these, breakdowns at low movement speeds and then differences in different movement classes. And what I hope to do is kind of set up the rest of the day in terms of some individual motor control and some joint action control. So rate control at the upper end there has well studied. The question here is really what happens at the lower end of that spectrum, and do we actually see breakdowns in how well people can coordinate very slow movements? So to get at this, very simple task, you just give people a dowel in their hands, put two targets on the table, vary the rate of a metronome that's pacing them, and just ask them move back and forth between these two targets in time with the metronome. No other specification, nothing about you have to move slowly and smoothly, just how are people going to organize their kinematics in that time frame when they're faced with either too little time almost to make these movements, but more interestingly, what if we give them more time than they strictly need to? What kind of kinematic principles can we actually derive to see how people actually handle that situation? So as you see, we had a range of movements. We also had people produce some trials where they just moved at their own rate to get some estimate of preferred frequencies. And then we can look at how they actually behave. So here's some trajectory examples. For the top left, the very fastest trials, but then the most interesting for our purposes, the bottom right, when we give people too much time, right? So the top left is fairly stereotypical. Single bell-shaped velocity profiles back and forth between targets. The bottom right, you actually see already some evidence that people are maybe subdividing the time interval. There's more than one velocity peak in those profiles. And we can analyze the kinematics and see what else people are actually up to when they're faced with that situation. So one thing you can look at is the proportional dwell time. How much time of the total duration are people spending just sitting on the target? Right? One way to avoid moving slowly is you just sit on the target longer, then you have a reasonable amount of time left and you make a fairly natural movement. So if that's the case, you would expect that beyond a certain point, people are just going to disproportionately put time on the target rather than into the movement. And that is exactly what you see here. On the left is the very short period, so people have to move very quickly. Very little time is spent on the target. If you go beyond about a second or so in this case, you see that people are actually increasing their time just dwelling on the target. If you then, and by the way, these dotted lines are the ranges of their preferred frequency when they're just asked to behave at their own pace. Of course, you get variability across people, but that's about the range of what people spend sitting on a target. If you look at peak velocities, so of course at the short periods people have to move fast, so the left side of the graph is rather obvious, but the interesting part is on the right side. By using some of the time sitting on the target, they actually achieve peak velocities that don't just keep declining and declining and declining. People actually end up making a relatively natural movement with the time that they have left after they have put some time on sitting on the target. So peak velocities kind of level off and stay fairly close to the range of preferred peak velocities. And then this is of course familiar to Tamar. If you look at their mean squared jerk, right, they also managed to avoid making very slow and jerky movements. Their jerk actually levels off. Of course, for the fast movements, they're more jerky. But typically, if you ask people to move very slowly, you would see an increase in jerk as well. And the way they solved the problem in this task, they actually avoid that part of the data here. So people seem to adjust here and adopt movement rates close to their preferred frequencies, and by doing so avoid moving slowly. Now, of course, we can ask, well, why is that exactly? Why is it so hard or so counterintuitive to move very slowly? Could be a couple of reasons. So it might be that just the updating of where your limb is in time relative to a target is just inefficient if you make very slow movements, which require a lot of updates. It might be that people are minimizing mean squared jerk. It might be that people are minimizing sub-movements, and it might have to do with timing and reduction in variability. So let me say a little bit more about each of those. So if you actually look at the brain's response, specifically secondary somatosensory and primary somatosensory cortices, as a function of movement frequency, and see how much of a response you get from the brain, you see on the plots on the right there that at the very low frequencies, so 0.3 hertz, the brain's response is actually lower in those areas. So it might be that those areas are not really tuned to updating at very, very low frequencies. It might be that it's better to be in the range where you see the increase in the number of updates that are being performed. And this makes, I think, intuitive sense, right? If you have to reach for a cup of coffee and you're going to do this, the brain is going to have to update constantly, where is my hand relative to the cup of coffee, and most of those updates are completely not interesting for getting your coffee. I'd like to just move my hand and get my coffee, thank you very much, right? So this could be one reason. Now, of course here, right, mean squared jerk, sorry for putting your picture up there. As I said, people avoid making very jerky movements. It's known at slow speeds. If you force them to move slowly, that you get jerky movements. Now, Tamara and Neville Hogan have nicely formulated this in mathematical terms of how you actually go about minimizing mean squared jerk. By avoiding slow movements, you're actually in some ways minimizing mean squared jerk. So that could be another possibility. And I'm sure Jason might have more to say about that too. We'll see. Related to this, it might be that people are minimizing the number of sub-movements they're making. So typically, we make just a single shot movement that has a nice bell-shaped velocity profile, one velocity peak in the middle, and that's about it. Sometimes we make two sub-movements, one that's called a ballistic phase that gets you kind of close to the target, and then a second movement that's more of a honing in, error correction type of phase. So you maybe get two sub-movements, but people typically avoid making more than two or so sub-movements to get a task done. So again, by moving very slowly, you would end up with a very bumpy velocity profile with a lot of sub-movement peaks that are just not very efficient and informative in terms of getting things done. So that could be another reason. And there are several theories on movement planning that would support that kind of interpretation. And as I said, you know, sub-movement wise, on the bottom right, you actually see a couple of trajectories there that actually literally look like people are kind of like moving to the middle and then kind of making a second movement to actually get to the target. So even in the kinematics, just visually speaking, you see that some people are in fact subdividing the time interval that way. And then there's timing, right? Of course, timing itself, it's well known that timing longer intervals is actually more difficult in terms of reducing variability. So here's one example paper by Richard Ivory a long time ago, but this has been replicated many times. Either you ask people to tap at a given rate, or they listen to a pair of tones twice and then need to say, are these the same intervals or different intervals? So that's a perception task. In both cases, you see that the variability of either the produced intervals or the perceived intervals, the variability of that increases with longer time durations. So in other words, it's harder for us to time longer durations, okay? This holds for slow movements as well, right? If you move more slowly, you're creating longer durations for yourself. So you're making your control in terms of variability potentially more difficult. And I'd imagine that that comes into play when we're talking about playing cello and so forth as well, right? So the musicians, I'm sure, have a lot more to say about this than I do. So those are some reasons why there might be breakdowns at long driving periods. And I'm sure there will be more on that today, and we'll see how that ties in. Now, the second part I wanted to talk about is that there's also differences in different movement classes. It's not just that motor control is motor control. There's wide variability in just the kinds of tasks people use, and then the kinds of mechanisms that come into play, depending on what you ask people to do, right? So I think I have a nice example that kind of sets the stage for that. Elizabeth Torres, actually at Rutgers New Brunswick, actually, well, not even recently anymore, but came up with this nice kind of continuum of, you know, goal-directed movement versus more automatic movements, whether movements are discrete single-shot movements, like grabbing your cup of coffee, right, single movement, goal-directed, versus riding a bike or walking, which is this much more continuous, not so much in some ways goal-directed activity. Movements differ along these dimensions. So rhythmic movements versus goal-directed discrete movements in some ways are a very different beast. Now, this video I was going to show, but I don't know that it's going to work. I can describe it quickly. It's actually a video from Bas Bloem in Nijmegen. At some point I had the pleasure of briefly working with him as well. The one on the left is supposed to be a video of a Parkinson patient in a hallway who's trying to start walking, but has massive freezing of gait, right? So the first step is very difficult because that's initiating a movement. It's in some ways a discrete kind of thing, right? I'm now starting a goal, right? Parkinson patients have notorious difficulty with doing this, as we'll hear, I'm sure, in the next talk as well. So that's sort of speaking to, well, that's one kind of class of movement. Then what they did, and I think only the Dutch would do this, whenever I give this talk in America, they're like, wow, these Dutch are so unethical. They just put this guy, he just showed me, this guy can't walk, and then they put him on a bike. What are these guys thinking? Not even a helmet. This is insanity, right? Calm down. You put him on the bike, give him a little push-off so that the bike starts rolling, and off he goes. Nice little circle, no problem at all, okay? Now, of course, there, right, you got him going, you get haptic feedback from the pedals, it's this rhythmic continuous movement, not a problem, okay? So I think it's a really nice clinical demonstration in that sense that movement is not movement. There's different classes, and depending on what parts of the brain are in some cases disturbed, you get very kind of different symptomatology, right? So when we think about just studying healthy participants, we got to think about that too. What kind of tasks are you actually asking people to do? That ties in with my joint action work, so I'll make a little bit of a leap here. A lot of what I study now is about coordination between people, and in that field, there is sort of two approaches. People are either focusing again on very single shot, discrete, goal-directed task, like, okay, you see a stimulus, you need to push button A or B, or more rhythmic movements where people are, for example, put next to each other in rocking chairs and you look at the kinds of frequencies and the coordination patterns that they produce. These are very different schools of thought, right? In the more planned joint action literature, the question is often, well, what kind of representations do people form when they act alongside other people? And this is actually what I did during my postdoc with Nathalie Zeebans and Günther Knoblich. They're known for their work on joint action. All that started with just one single paradigm. And, you know, for those who are PhD students, Nathalie told me this more than once. Just one simple study started this whole field, okay? So, and it was a really simple tweak on a well-known task called the Simon task. In the Simon task, you just get a stimulus. There's one relevant dimension, in this case, the color of the ring on the finger. If it's red, you push the left button. If it's green, you push the right button. But then there's this irrelevant stimulus dimension, which is the pointing direction of that finger. And it turns out, if you ask people to do this by themselves, they are faster to respond if the finger happens to point in the direction of the response location, okay? So this is a well-known stimulus-response compatibility effect. Now, Nathalie, during her PhD, so there's the reaction time effect, had the smarts to split this task between two people. Each has just one button. So, you know, I am right guy and you're a green guy. We do this task together. And in principle, you wouldn't think that there would be a stimulus-response compatibility effect because I just have one thing. That it's just right in front of me. There's no spatial dimension to it. It's just this is my button, the other one is not. However, if we form some sort of representation of the rest of the task that Jason is performing next to me, I might actually get the same compatibility effect. And that is in fact exactly what happens, as you see in the middle panel. When people do this task together, they are slower in the incompatible trials than the compatible trials. If you ask people to just do half the task completely on their own, you don't get that effect. So on the right, you see there's no compatibility effect there. So based on that finding, Nathalie and others claimed, well, we are somehow forming these representations of other people's tasks, and this actually helps us in joint action, it helps with coordination and so forth, okay? So that's one approach. Then the question is, what does that have to say about fish swimming together? Are they all co-representing each other? I don't think so, right? Of course not. So the other side of the joint action work is typically a dynamical systems approach where they use rhythmic coordination across different units, right? Different limbs or different people, and then they see to what extent they fall in synchrony with each other or not. And they've done that with, you know, pendulum swinging, as I said, well, aliens rocking their legs around, and then also people sitting in rocking chairs. And you get this finding that people fall in synchrony with each other more often than you would expect based on chance. Okay. So I thought, okay, here you have this massive theoretical divide on how joint action works, but from a motor control perspective, these are very different tasks. One is a discrete goal-directed task, the other one is a continuous rhythmic task. can I design, I'll skip over this real quick. Can I design a task where you actually just change one thing about the task itself and get evidence for entrainment versus co-representation in the same exact framework, okay? So as you see, two people sat next to each other. Again, here come my dots. People move back and forth between two targets. And as you see on the right, in some cases, one of them had to move over an obstacle. Of course, they had to make higher movements. The question is, what does the person next to them do? Do they also make higher movements, even though they're not moving over an obstacle themselves? Okay? And then we manipulated whether they could see each other's movements or not by sometimes introducing an occluder. They knew what each other's task was, but then as soon as they started, we would actually put the occluder down so they couldn't see each other's movements. Okay? And that's important because for entrainment, you would expect that entrainment happens if you get some pacing signal from the other person's movement. If there's no pacing signal, you wouldn't expect entrainment to happen. Okay? What we then played around was with the metronome rate. So either it was discrete movements, you get a metronome that beeps, you make one movement and back, then you sit still for 2 seconds, or it was a continuous movement where people move back and forth. Okay? So this is basically a very basic paradigm playing around with whether co-representation should show up for discrete movements and whether entrainment should happen for continuous movements. Just some example trajectories, right? So the top you see discrete back and forth and then pause, and then the bottom is continuous movements. We calculate the difference in their movement height depending on whether the other person is moving over an obstacle or not. And the question is, if it's 0, they're not changing anything about their own movements. If it's somehow higher, it means that I'm moving higher because the guy next to me is moving over an obstacle. So here are the results. The discrete case, you actually, regardless of whether you see the other person's task, you get that people move about 3 centimeters higher when the person next to them is moving over an obstacle. That would be predicted based on co-representation, right? I know what your task is. I don't actually have to see it. As a consequence, I know you're moving over an obstacle. My movements are slightly higher, okay? On the other hand, the continuous case, entrainment, as I said, you would expect with a visual signal. You don't give them the other person's input, you don't get entrainment. It's the third bar there. If they can see the other person to their side, you actually do get entrainment and people do end up moving higher. Okay? So I think it's a nice demonstration where, you know, when we study movement, it's not just tortoise versus hare, it's not just dynamical systems versus representations. We really have to take seriously many aspects of the actual movement task itself. Right, so manipulations of movement rate really can provide a rich window in that sense into action cognition. We have to be serious about what kind of action types we're asking people to produce, discrete versus continuous movement, in some ways a different universe in the brain as well as behavior. Action goals, right, is there a very concrete goal or not? Changes how people behave. Coordination, are we talking about across people, across different limbs? And then timing processes, and then of course also clinical pathology, whether, you know, people with Parkinson's, people after stroke, to what extent are these different mechanisms impacted and how do people adapt? So I think that's it for my starting talk here. Thank you. And all that was about Nikolai Bernstein, by the way, just to be clear, right?
We have time for questions. So.
Just another maybe short comment to follow up on Tamar's point. I think it would be very interesting, and I imagine that you'd see maybe a similar kind of pattern in areas that are a lot more cognitive, in the sense that perhaps prefrontal cortex, you'd see a lot more kind of inhibitory control. And maybe the SMA also, because you kind of imagine sequencing is something that the SMA is a lot.
Yeah, so there is work on that. So again, I picked this paper because they just did passive movement, right? And that makes a big difference, of course. Right. So I would expect SMA and premotor cortex to get active when you're actually telling people some sort of task and they're actively producing the movement. In this case, I think they wanted to just see somatosensory cortex, what's the response at different rates. And of course, passive movement is much more controlled to do that. So. And then with MRI, you know, of course, with the amount of noise from just any movement. So keeping that controlled, it makes sense. But those are great questions, definitely. Thanks. Yeah.
Also a comment about the piano. Once in New York, I listened to a lecture by Baryshnikov, and he was asked, how is it I can jump so high? And he said, I'm not jumping so high, I just play who invites who. The music invites me, or I invite the music. And then there was a beautiful conversation with the conductor that worked a lot with, and he said like he actually starts the movement, and at the peak of his jump, the conductor know exactly how to catch it, and it's the perception is as if he's jumped so high, how the music lifts him up. And so I feel like there's also about what is a target to get and how you get to the target and the timing, and again, there's so much around it.
Definitely, yeah. Well, and there's some work too where some of these rhythms and these pitches are actually also embodied. So they've done some studies where you couple high-pitched tones with upward movement versus downward movement, and the upward is way more congruent, and people pick up on that much more quickly. So it's all this. In psych, we do this a lot where we have these supposed subfields of psych, right? And then students come to me, I'm a social psychologist, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm like, people, it's all the same system, it's all the same brain. So, perceptual systems are going to influence, motor systems are going to influence emotional systems. Yeah, so I very much agree with you, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Robrecht.
Yep.
Well, also, thank you.